Sometimes a story is told, retold, and adapted so many times that we forget exactly what the words mean. We hear them repeated over and over, and they become cliches instead of meaningful prose. There are plenty of William Shakespeare adaptations where it feels like the actors are simply regurgitating famous lines instead of inhabiting the characters saying those lines. Sadly, this can also happen with A Christmas Carol. It's one of the most influential books ever written. Even if you've never read Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, you are familiar with it. My name is Collin Murr, and I've loved this story for as long as I can remember. I'm going to be taking a look at all of the movie and TV adaptations of A Christmas Carol that I can, because I love the story that much. This is Scrooge, the Christmas Carol podcast. Episode 7, The BBC, Rich Little, and Oscar the Grouch. In 1977, the BBC staged a version of A Christmas Carol starring Michael Hordern as Ebenezer Scrooge. Hordern played Jacob Marley in both Scrooge from 1951 and the Richard Williams short from 1971, but now he was playing the lead role. The BBC version is minimalist. Very minimalist. That alone isn't a problem, as that's a style that a production can lean into and still make something great. The 1935 film, for the most part, is relatively minimalist, and it still has a unique sense of style. However, in addition to the almost non-existent set design, this thing is dark. Not in terms of subject matter, just in terms of the lighting. Try turning your screen's brightness up all the way and see if you can make out what's going on the screen. I get that they want to show that darkness is cheap and Scrooge liked it, but this feels more like darkness is cheap and it's all the BBC can afford. We've seen some great Scrooges and some awful Scrooges, but nearly every Scrooge so far has taken big swings and gone all in on their performance. Michael Hordern is fine. It's just like he's reading his lines most of the time. And while there's nothing really wrong with it, there's not really anything right with it. It's just fine. There is one character choice he makes that doesn't quite work, but I can appreciate why he goes for it. Hordern, particularly in his older age, had a deep, resonant voice that was simultaneously commanding and warm, which made him the perfect choice for a character like Gandalf in Lord of the Rings, or even the narrator of Barry Lyndon.
If you say that again, Bilbo, I shall get angry, and then you shall see Gandalf the Grey uncloaked.
That voice wouldn't exactly work for Ebenezer Scrooge, so he changed it up a bit, but it often just comes off as awkward. He also plays Scrooge as having a cold, which is right out of the book, but it's a lot to listen to and watch. Additionally, he has Scrooge's voice crack throughout, presumably to make him sound a bit ridiculous.
Hundreds of thousands are without common comfort, sir.
Are there no prisons?
Oh, plenty of prisons.
And the union workhouses, are they still in operation?
Again, none of these choices are very damaging, it's just all kind of there. You've heard of underwhelming and overwhelming, this is just regular whelming. This adaptation starts on the lonely funeral of Jacob Marley, and the coldness and the darkness of that event fit the minimalist style just fine. We also hear God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen over the opening credits, which makes this the third version so far to include that one. As I mentioned with the 1971 short, it is the only song mentioned in the text of the story. If you're keeping score, that makes it 3 for God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, this, the Richard Williams short, and the 1949 one, and 3 for Hark the Herald Angels Sing, Scrooge 1935, Scrooge 1951, and Scrooge 1970. Just another nonsense statistic I'll keep track of as we go. At any point when an outdoor scene is needed, we get obviously sketched backdrops. It really feels like a filmed stage production of A Christmas Carol, with the exception of some brief ghost effects. Now, it's clear that the writer of this version was trying to get as many things from the book as possible into it, because on paper it feels shockingly faithful. However, it does not really focus on being an adaptation at all. There's no real rise and fall to the scenes, and they simply play out without anything interesting happening. The Fred scene at the beginning incorporates basically all of the dialogue from the book, which isn't all that much, but it's not staged or performed interestingly, so it just feels interminable. The charity worker scene is the same. Everyone in this thing feels like they're just going through the motions and reading their lines. Maybe on stage it would play well, but on film it's often a bore. Interestingly, this version follows the book's lead and doesn't refer to Bob Cratchit by name in the opening scenes. Again, this shows that to Scrooge, he's nothing but a position. But I can't recall any film adaptation that actually makes this choice before this. Also, after Scrooge has the Marley scare with the door knocker, he also sees him on a mural on his wall. That's the first time I've been able to give a full point in that column, too, with the biblical murals. Marley is played by John LeMessurier, and fans of the BBC radio version of Lord of the Rings will be amused that in this scene, Gandalf is being haunted by Bilbo. LeMessurier is clearly going for mellow sadness, much different than Hordern's own take on the character, and you have to wonder how he felt about watching that. But the way LeMessurier reads the lines, it just comes off like he's annoyed.
It is required of every man that the spirit within him should walk abroad amongst his fellow men. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is compelled to do so after death.
It feels like they had to fit as much as possible into the hour, so he just reads them faster than most actors would. They could have easily cut back on the wordiness of the scene and tried to make it atmospheric, but this adaptation seems to think the more words the better. Adapting a work successfully takes a whole lot more than just using the same words. Scrooge also glimpses the wandering spirits outside his window, but we get no indication of their purpose, and it's just a scare scene. The Ghost of Christmas Past is played by Patricia Quinn, who does fine, but it's distracting that her costuming makes her have long hair, but she's completely bald on top. I don't know what they were going for. Maybe something androgynous, but it doesn't work. She shows him all of the scenes from the past that are in the book, although, like most versions, we don't actually see literary characters coming to life. The scene with young Scrooge and his sister is also awkward, as it feels like it plays more like romantic interaction than a familial one. There is a nice little touch in the Fezziwig scene, as our introduction to that character is him watching the clock for the end of the day, just like Cratchit did in the opening scene. It nicely shows, with some visual storytelling, that Cratchit is much more like this kindly employer than Scrooge is. However, we also get a real sense of the minimalism at Fezziwig's party, where darkness and an overlay of Michael Hordern's face try to mask the fact that there are probably 3 people attending this joyous party. Like in the book, we only meet Belle at the breakup, and we do then get a scene of her and her husband. Still, I quite like Zoe Wanamaker in the role, as she has these big, expressive eyes, and we see that she is still an idealistic person, despite seeing the realism of the situation with Scrooge. It's really the only performance in this whole thing that stands out, so credit where credit is due. Seeing as how this adaptation strives for accuracy, you might be wondering how they'll attack the Christmas present scenes that don't simply take place in a house, since the budget is so low. Well, they don't. We just get the Cratchits, Fred's party, and ignorance and want. I suppose accuracy can only go so far when your budget has a decimal in it. The Ghost of Christmas Present is played by Bernard Lee, who originated the role of Q in the James Bond films. He doesn't really have a lot of the joyfulness associated with the character. So many bad adaptations are bad in unique ways, but this one is just boring in a general sense, which makes it much harder to review in an interesting way. Well, like with Scrooge 1970, Bob Cratchit is played by a younger man than usually plays the part, as actor Clive Merrison was only 32. However, his children appear to be the ages they are in the book, and Merrison did not quite look as young as David Collins did in the 1970 film. So I don't think the character is supposed to be any younger than he is in the book. I just think they cast a younger actor. With Collins in Scrooge 1970, they were intentionally playing up that he was younger, a little more vibrant, and I thought he was pretty good in that one. Here, Clive Merrison, like most people in this, he does all right. The minimalism of this production does briefly work at the beginning of Christmas Yet to Come. The ghost appears shrouded in smoke and standing at a distance from Scrooge. Sure, it's a very stagey take on this entrance, but it's still effective. Beyond that, though, the ghost barely appears on screen. This adaptation opts to combine the people bartering Scrooge's things scene with the Scrooge sees a dead body under a sheet scene. Instead of seeing his things being sold at Old Joe's shop, we see Mrs. Dilber and the Undertaker's employee both robbing the body at the same time. It's a pretty smart way to combine these two scenes while keeping the gist of both. Then, for the first time in any of these adaptations, we get the scene of the couple happy about Scrooge's death. I think I've mostly just referred to them as the couple because in the book we learned that the woman is named Caroline, but we never get her husband's name, so depending on the adaptation, they might be named or not, but here we just get Caroline and her husband like in the book. In this nearly forgotten, low-budget TV adaptation of all places, we get this scene for the first time. Scrooge asks to see someone who feels emotion over this man's death, and the ghost shows him a couple who owe him money, now hopeful that their new creditor will be more forgiving. This version also includes some dialogue that's not always adapted when we see the Cratchits mourning Tiny Tim. Bob mentions that Fred passed him on the street and talked with him, sensing something was wrong. He even gave him his card and said to stop by his house if he ever needed anything. This would be a big punch to the gut for Scrooge at this point, as he sees Bob every day but does nothing for him. Yet Fred, who barely knows Bob Cratchit, is prepared to drop everything and help him simply out of the kindness of his heart. As with most things in this adaptation, Scrooge's redemption is serviceable, but there's nothing spectacular about it either. The Christmas morning scenes are very rushed, presumably due to both the previous scenes of lengthy dialogue and the fact that they couldn't afford many street sets. Scrooge talks to a boy about a turkey, dresses happily for the day, and then we see him at Fred's. He makes up to Cratchit the next day, but the office still looks just as dark as before, which doesn't make a lot of sense stylistically. This adaptation shows that simply adapting the most things from the book does not necessarily lead to the most faithful adaptation. This version was clearly written by someone who knew the book well, but there is just nothing unique about it. It's devoid of style. None of the performances really leap off the screen, and it just leaves you feeling empty. There are plenty of versions of A Christmas Carol that sound like they will be mostly comedic, only for them to surprise you and take the story quite seriously. If Mr. Magoo can play the source material straight, you can never really know what you're in for. However, with a title like Rich Little's Christmas Carol, there's only one way this can really go. If you don't know who Rich Little is, consider yourself lucky. For a time, he was the most famous impressionist in the world, based mostly on impressions of celebrities who all sounded the same. In 1978, CBC gave him an hour for his all impressions version of A Christmas Carol, and it would air on HBO the next year. Since Rich is playing all the major and secondary roles here, there is plenty of camera trickery and editing to make him interact with himself. As with pretty much every impressionist, some of the impressions are good, and some aren't so good. But there's a bigger problem here. It's not funny. Oh no, it's not some surprisingly sincere take on the story like the Muppets or Mr. Magoo gave us. I'm sure this thinks it's funny, but it's not. This special seems to think that simply hearing an impression will make you laugh. Not unless they're actually saying something funny. We start on a bustling street, filled with plenty of extras who actually aren't Rich Little. Before we meet Scrooge, we're treated to The Merriest Christmas Yet, a song that sounds like all the other songs in this thing. They're barely songs, they're more concepts of songs.
Christmas, yes, the merriest Christmas. This will be the merriest Christmas yet. This will be the merriest Christmas yet.
They have this very phony sounding choir in a forced, bouncy rhythm that sounds like it belongs on the theme song of a children's show. Don't know how to exactly describe them, but they all sound like they're commercials for songs. the songs are also just presumably filler. Little plays W.C. Fields as Scrooge, which is an understandable choice. The grumpy actor would have fit the role in a 1930s adaptation of the story. You could see him doing like the Reginald Owen version.
Ratchet, what are you doing jumping up and down like that? Are you loaded?
I mean, sure, this is 1978, but Rich Little wasn't exactly known for his modern impressions. He could basically do variations on a transatlantic accent. Scrooge here is said to work in the boat and bottle business. Scrooge drinks from bottles, so Bob Cratchit can put model boats in them. Hilarious. Little does a Paul Lynde impression for Bob Cratchit, and the less said about that, the better. He does hilarious things like singing Stayin' Alive because he's cold and telling outdated vaudeville jokes directly to the camera.
What a skinflint. Do you know he's so cheap he even has a burglar alarm on his garbage can?
There's also a laugh track in this because no one was going to laugh organically at this trick. Rich Little was best known for his Johnny Carson impression, which he uses to portray the character of Fred here. And if you've heard it, you know it is a pretty good Johnny Carson impression.
May an unclean chemist put Drano in your snuff box.
But Bob Cratchit even does a "Here's Freddy" line when Fred enters, and the theme from The Tonight Show plays, just in case you didn't get the joke. He then looks directly into the camera and tells jokes about how cheap Scrooge is, and how cold it is in the office. His invitation to Christmas dinner is played like a Karnak the Magnificent skit. It's not funny, but again, this special seems to think that getting a reference equates to comedy. The charity workers are played as Laurel and Hardy, and let's just say it's a relief when the second one walks in and we realize the dark-haired man with the toothbrush mustache is supposed to be Oliver Hardy. When Scrooge gets home, he meets the ghost of Jacob Marley, as played by Richard Nixon. This is at least an impression someone watching in 1978 might appreciate, but he again simply loads it with references.
Expect the first when the bell tolls 1. The second 18 and a half minutes later.
That's painful enough. But then he turns right to the camera and says, "They'll never let me forget about those 18 and a half minutes." We get it. See, if there was actually any effort put into this thing, the jokes could actually work. You could reword these jokes in such a way that they're funny while still keeping a reference. So, in the book, Marley says, "Expect the first ghost when the bell tolls 1." And then they have him say that here, followed by, "Expect the second ghost 18 and a half minutes later." Very awkward. All they had to do was have him change it a little bit and say, "Expect the first ghost in an hour. Expect the second ghost 18 and a half minutes later." That fits a new rhythm. Not exactly funny, but it is at least set up and payoff. It shows you're altering the script in the name of making a joke instead of just awkwardly shoving references in. I will admit the single chuckle I got from this movie does come from the Nixon scene, when he says, "You don't believe in me," a line from the book, and Scrooge says, "No, no, and neither did anybody else." Okay, it furthers the character and story while still being mildly funny, as opposed to just being a reference. For The Ghost of Christmas Past, Rich Little is allegedly playing Humphrey Bogart. I say allegedly because it sounds absolutely nothing like him.
I'm the ghost of Christmas past. So rise and walk with me. You're taking the fall.
We only know it's Bogart because As Time Goes By plays in the background, followed by him rattling off an awkward series of references to his movies.
All right, shut up and listen, fat man. I guess you thought I was going to play the patsy for you, huh? I do know this, Moose Breath. Fred C. Dobbs don't say nothing he don't mean.
They're barely related to the scene either. I don't know, I feel like if you're known as an impressionist, you should really only include good impressions in your All Impressions Christmas Carol. The canned audience who isn't there seems to be eating it up, though. We get another song at Fezziwig's party called "It's a Typical Office Party." And it's ironic this aired on HBO because this song really sounds like it wants to sell me dish soap.
The champagne and the beer is overflowing. There's singing and the dancing and a lot of lips are mistletoeing. Oh, what a lovely feeling that we have going here.
Fezziwig is played by Rich doing Groucho Marx, which could be amusing if only the past impressions were from the 1930s, but that would be too smart for this thing. Jimmy Stewart as Dick Wilkins duets with young Scrooge on It's Better to Give Than to Receive, and I have no idea why there are songs in this thing, except that they needed to stretch it to an hour. It's a fine Jimmy Stewart, but anyone can do a Jimmy Stewart, so I'm not impressed. The majority of this scene is just the two songs, and I could rant about how there's no sign of Scrooge once being young and optimistic, but what's the point of that? This thing is not being done sincerely or with love. It's a showcase for some average to good impressions. The Ghost of Christmas Present is played by Peter Falk as Columbo, which is pretty much just Bogart again. I mean, these two are so similar that Falk played a Bogart parody in Murder by Death in 1976. That film also isn't funny, but it's more inspired than this. These impressions also just feel like rehashes of his Carson. I'll admit I was relieved when I first saw the Cratchits because Rich Little wasn't also playing all of the children. However, he does play Mrs. Cratchit as Gene Stapleton playing Edith Bunker. At least they're in the right decade. Then he shows up as Tiny Tim, and I realized I spoke too soon. Little plays Tiny Tim as Truman Capote, which just serves to add a few short jokes to all the gay jokes.
Oh, that's their little lame son, Tiny Tim. Brilliant little kid. Wants to be a writer when he grows up. The only problem is, sir, he's already grown up.
Christmas Yet to Come is played as Peter Sellers as Inspector Clouseau, because apparently the ghost budget for this film only allowed for one trench coat. It could, of course, be amusing that all three ghosts are detectives. Well, in one case, with Bogart, an actor who played a detective. But nothing is done with that. No connection is made between them. They don't solve anything for Scrooge, and no one points out that they all have the same wardrobe. We get that famous scene of men talking outside the exchange. They're just in the street here, but still. And it gives Little an excuse to show off 3 more impressions that he can shove into one scene. Admittedly, one of them is a very good James Mason impression.
I don't believe it. He finally passed on, did he?
Another is obviously John Wayne based on the wardrobe, but it's very possibly the worst John Wayne impression I've ever heard.
Well, I'm told they're gonna bury him face down.
The third, I had absolutely no idea. A few of the impressions were listed in the opening, but this wasn't, so I was completely at a loss as to who this was supposed to be. Listen and see if you have any idea who this is supposed to be.
Yeah, well, that's just so he can see where he's going.
Well, that wouldn't work unless they first soaked the ground with booze.
Do you have a guess? Anyway, I looked it up, and apparently it's George Burns. Sure, why not? Sounds absolutely nothing like George Burns, but sure, that's George Burns. It's kind of dumb to analyze this one to see if it has a believable transformation for Scrooge, but obviously it doesn't. I can say it's better than the Australian one from the 60s, and that one was clearly trying to be an actual adaptation, but that's about it. Of course, since it's W.C. Fields, he also promises to give up drinking. On Christmas morning, the young boy in the street is played as Jack Benny, which is probably the best impression in the thing.
Buy what? The turkey in the butcher shop. Oh, sure. What with? Snowballs? Good point.
Which is interesting because Benny didn't quite have a unique voice like many of the other celebrities he's doing here. In fact, Little played Benny as Scrooge on a 1960s album of Christmas Carol impressions, and that would have been preferable here to W.C. Fields. As Scrooge walks the street on Christmas morning, we get an Ain't Christmas Grand song called That's What I Like About Christmas. It's the worst version of this kind of song. It's just listing things that happen on Christmas. And like everything else in this special, it just sounds like it's advertising a song. We get one final impression the day after Christmas when Scrooge realizes he can't continue in the boat and bottle business anymore until he finds someone who can drink from the bottles. He hears Dean Martin singing outside his door and decides he'll be fine. Of course, this joke relies on 1840s Ebenezer Scrooge knowing who Dean Martin is, but whatever, at least it's over. Oftentimes, bad drama can be fun to watch. If it fails in every way and ends up being laugh out loud hilarious, it's a good time. That said, there are no laughs to be had with bad comedy. When people fail at being serious, it can be funny. When people fail at being funny, it's not funny, it's just sad. This special is 50 minutes of sad. The timing is terrible, the jokes are worse, the impressions are inconsistent and outdated, and it's making no attempt to actually riff on its own source material. Why are you even doing a Christmas Carol if you have no intention of having laughs at the expense of a Christmas Carol? There is nothing of note in this thing, nothing to recommend, nothing to laugh at. Unless you're for some reason a die-hard Rich Little fan, in which case you know about this anyway, I can't recommend anything about this. We'll move on to another very 70s Christmas Carol adaptation, A Special Sesame Street Christmas. I debated whether I should even include A Special Sesame Street Christmas, since it's such a weird outlier, but then again, it's one of the weirdest Christmas things I've ever seen. It's barely a Christmas Carol adaptation, but it does have a through line of Oscar the Grouch being visited by ghosts, so here we go. 1978 gave viewers two Sesame Street Christmas specials. One, called Christmas Eve on Sesame Street, had a bunch of famous characters, aired on PBS, and is regarded as a classic by many Muppet fans. This is the other one. Have you ever read a series of books written by a single author, but maybe the author dies and another author takes over, and they don't quite get the voice? Maybe characters start doing things they wouldn't normally do, or they don't talk like they used to. Well, this is that, but for Sesame Street. Christmas Eve on Sesame Street was directed by John Stone, who had been with Sesame Street from the beginning. Special Sesame Street Christmas was directed by Russ Petranto, who worked as a director for scripted TV shows and variety specials. He had never worked on a Sesame Street or Muppet production before, and it shows. Additionally, this aired on CBS instead of PBS, and it only has a handful of cast members from Sesame Street. The Sesame Street book Street Gang, written by Michael Davis, talks about this in detail. Davis writes, Paul Furstenberg was Children's Television Workshop's executive vice president in 1978, when Christmas Eve on Sesame Street was produced. One of his most baffling decisions, which included selling off interest in cable television that would later be valued in the hundreds of millions, was to sign a deal that same year for A Special Sesame Street Christmas with independent television producer Bob Banner. Banner, whose roots in variety television went back to the Gary Moore and Dinah Shore shows of the 1950s, had a track record of working with Henson and the Muppets from his days producing The Jimmy Dean Show. CBS bought the idea even though there was one in the works for PBS. When executive producer Singer questioned the wisdom of competing specials, Furstenberg said, quote, "If we proceed with two shows, maybe one will make it to air." Said Singer, quote, "Can you imagine the mentality? He had a complete lack of understanding of the show." The only Sesame Street characters in this thing are Big Bird, Oscar the Grouch, Bob, Maria, David, and Mr. Hooper, with a brief cameo from Barkley the dog. The real star of this special is guest star Leslie Uggams, who is trying to get Oscar the Grouch to be nicer. Also, she acts throughout the special like she wants to sleep with him. It's very weird. There are little tidbits here and there, like Big Bird getting Leslie a gift she has no use for, which leads the group to sing It's the Thought That Counts, one of the few songs that seems to be original to this special. It feels more like a variety show than a Sesame Street special. The plot, I guess, picks off when the gang decides Oscar's attitude towards Christmas isn't good and needs to change. Leslie and Oscar sing back and forth about things they like and dislike about the holiday, in a song that IMDb calls Christmas Bleck and Muppet Wiki calls Leslie Oscar Duet.
Time when landlords turn down the heat. Morning windows twinkling with frost. Buying snow tires at the high cost.
Leslie and Maria also find an injured cat they name Tiny Tim, and they try to get Oscar to help the cat. Because Oscar doesn't want to, they decide it's time to put a scare into Oscar with 3 ghosts. At Hooper's store, they convince their friend Anne Murray, just go with it, to be the first ghost, but first she has to sing the entirety of her song, You Needed Me. Not sure what that has to do with Christmas, and she had songs that had to do with Christmas, but sure. Anne shows Oscar his early years as a Grouch, and here's where this gets really weird. Anne has Oscar look through an eggnog container, which she promises will show him his past. They're working with the props they have. And by that I mean the characters in universe. They know they're using cheap props. It's just enough to make Oscar believe it. Leslie sings Look at How Fast We Forget, a song about how Oscar used to be a happy child who loved Christmas, and the other cast members act out a street scene from presumably the Roaring Twenties.
Try to remember when everyone was your friend. You filled the world up with glee. When people looked at you, they would go Grouchy-Goo. You were the best baby yet.
In this special's defense, I guess, I assumed this had to be a reworking of a song from a musical, but it's actually original to the special. However, Oscar tells Anne that his life wasn't like this at all, and they just wasted their time putting this together. He argues that he comes from a long line of Grouches, and he even shows a portrait of one. And then he pulls out a guitar and sings a song that was important to him in his childhood.
Bring in the papers and the trash, or you don't get no spending cash. If you don't scrub that kitchen floor, you ain't gonna rock
That's
and roll
Yakety
no
Yak.
more.
What decade was he born in, the 20s or the 50s? Wait, hold on. What's the first line of that song again?
Bring in the papers and the trash.
Yeah, that's a song about cleaning up trash. Why would that be important to someone who lives in a trash can? For some reason, the guitar then causes an explosion that blows up some of the set. I don't know. I really don't know. After this, Leslie Uggams stares at Oscar lovingly from a window in the apartment building and sings Look at That Face from The Roar of the Grease Paint, The Smell of the Crowd. Not the most popular musical. Fun fact, this musical was co-written by Leslie Bricusse. We talked about him when we talked about Scrooge the musical. For Christmas present, the gang has Imogene Coca play the ghost and show Scrooge how much people love Christmas with the song Christmas Morning. We get a very weird scene where kids and adults talk about what they love about Christmas. It could be really sweet, but none of these are Sesame Street characters, though. It's just kids and adults who got brought in for this special. Most of them are unknowns, but one of them is Henry Fonda.
Christmas is still being in my bathrobe at 11 o'clock in the morning, sitting in my easy chair.
He's on screen for 14 seconds. Throw in the 8 seconds he gets on screen in the opening montage, and he is in this thing for less than 30 seconds. What is the purpose of Henry Fonda being in this at all? Also, there's one kid in this scene who terrifies me.
Christmas is licking the frosting off a cookie, then putting it back on the plate without anybody seeing it.
Oscar is clearly not buying it, though, and people start to lose hope. There's, of course, only one person who can save them from this despair. Ethel Merman.
Hi, Leslie. Merry Christmas. Imogene, what's the matter? You look like an idiot.
Is this the only instance of someone being called an idiot on Sesame Street? I feel like that goes against the whole vibe of the place. Ethel then sings that song everyone knows her for, Tomorrow from Annie. Sure, whatever. At this point, nothing's gonna shock me. Ethel was never in a production of Annie, and the song was pretty new at this point, but sure, Tomorrow from Annie by Ethel Merman on a Sesame Street special, why not? This cheers everybody up, and they continue in their pursuit of scaring Oscar. Michael Jackson walks by and gives Oscar a book about ghosts because that was necessary. Oscar is then visited by the next guest star they could afford for 3 minutes, Dick Smothers, playing the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come. He just kind of tells Oscar that if he doesn't start being nicer, people will move away and the cat will die. Well, he gives Oscar an empty collar because Cat Death was a little too dark for this special. Not for Sesame Street as a whole, because they tackled death very well, but this special, no reference to death. Anyway, this finally works on Oscar, and he agrees to embrace the Christmas spirit and be nice to a cat. The gang sings Just One Person, which originated from Snoopy the Musical, but over time became an unofficial Muppet anthem. Yes, you will laugh when the Sesame Street characters call a group of 3 people a threesome, just accept it. With our story all wrapped up but a few minutes left to fill, we just have Ethel Merman sing some Christmas carols. I mean, okay, it's a whole group of people, but who do you think stands out?
Jingle bells, jingle all the way.
Look, I have no idea. I have spent a lot of time watching bad, weird, and completely out there Christmas specials, and this thing leaves me speechless. The only reference point I can make is the Star Wars Holiday Special, which similarly borrows a famous pop culture thing, takes a few characters from it, and just puts a variety show around it. Guest stars and songs come and go at the drop of a hat, and there's barely a plot. Personally, I'm split on which is more inexplicable. The 14 seconds of Henry Fonda, or the part where Oscar plays Yakety Yak. Okay, we're going to run 2 of these 3 adaptations through the adaptation meter. I'm not going to do that with a special Sesame Street Christmas. It's not worth running through, but the other 2 are direct adaptations of the story, so let's see where they land. Rich Little's Christmas Carol is the one we'll handle first, and it scores 20.5, which is about 40 points more than it deserves, but yeah, it keeps the bare bones of the story. There's men talking about Scrooge and Christmas yet to come. There's a Fezziwig character. There's the Cratchits on Christmas Day. It has plenty of the beats, so it's using that to put a lot of Rich Little impressions in there, but it has the bare bones of the story, so it is adapting A Christmas Carol, so it's going to get some points. I don't think there's really any unique points that most adaptations don't have that this does. So, yeah, it takes the most common ones. One of the points I have is Scrooge is apprenticed under a kind man named Fezziwig, which I can really only give this half a point for because Fezziwig is a kind of skirt-chasing Groucho Marx here, so yeah, kind man, not so much. And same with Fezziwig throws a wonderful Christmas party because it doesn't look all that great. And the song even says it's a typical office party, so you get half a point for that one. Now, the Michael Hordern version, for the second week in a row, we have a new leader because that scores an impressive 69.5. That's 2 points higher than the Richard Williams cartoon. Now, again, that only had 25 minutes, but the Michael Hordern one is the most faithful adaptation of the story yet, in terms of exact plot points it keeps. Because in terms of anything else, it is by no means the most accurate adaptation. It understands what's in the book, but not why it's there. It just puts as much on the screen as it can, but not with any flow or meaning or anything like that. So, yeah, it's the most faithful adaptation at the moment in this scoreboard, but that doesn't mean it's the best or even the most meaningful. Those are 3 live action adaptations for the 70s. I have saved a big one for a separate episode that's going to be releasing the same time as this one, but I want to talk about An American Christmas Carol as its own episode. So stay tuned on this episode for my final thoughts on these 3, and then go over to the other one where you can hear me talk about An American Christmas Carol. And thank you for listening to Scrooge, a Christmas Carol podcast. Okay, so those are 3 very strange adaptations of A Christmas Carol. I mean, the Michael Hordern one is strange in just how weirdly straightforward it is. Because it's not doing anything unique with it. And like I said, it's hard to talk about a version that's trying to be like such a straightforward version, but without any unique voice. That's so weird. I know, it's just the BBC putting on a production of A Christmas Carol. And there's a version we're getting to in the future that I do know a lot of people like, but that I think personally suffers from a lot of the same issues as this Michael Hordern one. It keeps a lot from the book. There's stuff in this version that's upcoming that we don't see in a lot of other versions, but there's no real sense of style to it. It just feels like it's trying to include the most for the sake of including the most. And I mean, yeah, there's a certain kind of viewer who's going to enjoy that, and I get it because, it's things you like from the book, but if they're not done with a sense of style, what's the point? I love that passage from the book where he sees on Christmas Day the people underground and in a lighthouse and at sea all celebrating, and it's great, but if you're going to do that scene, you really got to go for it, and the Richard Williams cartoon nails that. The Michael Hordern one, thankfully, doesn't go for it because it would have been very underwhelming, but there are versions that kinda do it, but they don't go all in on it, and you really gotta nail the merrymaking in that scene because it's really atmospheric and sweet, but a lot of versions just kinda go halfway on it, so I think the Richard Williams one does that wonderfully. The Michael Hordern one, I just wish I had unique things to say about it because there's nothing here that isn't done better in another version. Every single scene, even though it keeps a lot of them, is done better in a different version. Closest is Belle, who I do think she's good here. I like this portrayal of Belle, but there's better Belles who have gone and who will come. This one's fine, but she makes an impression, which is rare in this movie. But she's not the best version of the character or anything. I like Michael Hordern a lot. I've talked a good bit about him on this podcast because I've talked about him when he played Jacob Marley in the 1951 film, and then when he played Jacob Marley in the 1971 short. Great Marley, great character actor, good voice. For what it's worth, I've heard his name pronounced Horden and Hordern. I think it's really somewhere in between that, but the pronunciation on the BBC Lord of the Rings radio production that I've heard him in, they tend to call him Horden, so I go with that, but if it's actually Hordern, I'm sorry. He was a really good actor, but again, Scrooge is a weird choice, and the affects he chooses here don't quite work. I think with a better director and more time and more production, he would have been a great Scrooge. He's not a great Scrooge here, which is a shame because that sounds like something that should work. Good character actor, but yeah, he's a little too commanding in certain scenes that call for Scrooge to be a little more fearful. Weirdly, again, that version that I'm hinting at that reminds me a lot of this one. The actor has the same issue there. I don't think it's going to be anyone's definitive version. I've tried to read some reviews of it and such, but it's pretty obscure. Some people say they like it because it's more faithful. Sure, I get that. It is more faithful, but no one's calling anything in this version definitive. I can't point to anything in this that feels like the definitive version of anything in the story. But we do get the first direct version of the Caroline and her husband scene, so we'll get more of that in the future. I know there's one or two other versions at least, and I'm sure more I'm not aware of that have that scene. But this is the first actual version of that, even though "Thank You Very Much" is the best version of that scene. That's more adjacent version of that scene. So yeah, the 1977 BBC version, it's easy to find on YouTube. Got actors in it who could be great, and none of them really are. It's just kind of there. Okay, Rich Little's Christmas Carol, which, I mean, yeah, I do not have anything nice to say about this. I'm sorry. It's a very specific kind of comedy. And if you like Rich Little, you're going to like this because it's a whole lot of Rich Little. I wish I could say more than just like, hey, some of the impressions aren't bad, but that's how it is. Some of them aren't very good, some of them are good, but that feels like such a pointless thing to review. I don't know. I've said too much about this already because songs aren't catchy. They all sound like they're selling me dish soap. This only could have come out of 1978. It has no staying power, and it shouldn't. It's my absolute least favorite version of the story I've watched so far. Even the 1969 cartoon, which is quite bad, was more redeemable than this. That had an actor as Scrooge who was actually trying, and it had Marley's funeral at the beginning, which at least was a little bit of visual storytelling. So that's more redeemable than this, and that one's awful. So yeah, Rich Little's Christmas Carol, again, if this appeals to you, you already know about it. But I'm not going to say more about that because I don't like reviewing bad comedy. But I do have a lot to say about a special Sesame Street Christmas because, again, For years, I have tried to watch the weirdest, strangest, obscure Christmas specials and movies, and I hadn't been made aware of this for a long time because I just assumed that naturally any Muppet Sesame Street adjacent property has to be at least somewhat good. They're always done so well. I mean, there's not really a bad Muppet movie theatrically released, right? I mean, even like the worst Muppet movie is still a good movie. So I never even would have considered a Muppet or Sesame Street special to be a bad one. But I found out about this. I'm gonna mention this guy I mentioned before, his YouTube channel, Collin Looks Back. Great series called So Many Christmas Carols. He gave me a very nice shout out recently as well. Again, go to his YouTube channel, watch the series. We have similar thoughts on a lot of these adaptations. But I was listening to that and he got to a special Sesame Street Christmas. I got about 3 minutes into the review and I said to myself, okay, this is so weird. I'm going to stop the review here because I want to be surprised by how weird this special is. So I got to the point where he mentions that Oscar sings Yakety Yak. And at that point, I'm like, okay, no, I have to watch this for myself because it is that weird. And I have gone back and watched the rest of the review recently. He also mentions that there's only 14 seconds of Henry Fonda. We came to our times separately. But yeah, there is so little Henry Fonda in this. This is one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. I guess it makes more sense if you imagine it being set on a variety show stage instead of on Sesame Street. And I think that's kind of how you have to look at it. It still doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, it's up there with like the Paul Lynde Halloween special, but it's weirder than that. I have to imagine kids who tuned into this were A, bored, but also just confused. I mentioned that in the quote about the production of this, that the producer had worked with the Muppets back in the Jimmy Dean days. Now, that was one of Jim Henson's earliest breaks, was Rolf the dog was a character on the Jimmy Dean show, variety show in the 60s. Yeah, that's where Rolf came from, and I guess the guy who produced this had worked with them on that. If you watch Defunctland on YouTube, they have a great 5 or 6 part series about the history of Jim Henson and the Muppets. Just fantastic stuff. Yeah, so that's how this special came about, and it's clearly made by people who don't understand what they're working with. It's so weird. I mentioned the character of David. Now, if you're a little bit younger, you might not know him. He was on Sesame Street. He was the boyfriend of the Maria character who's in this and who was on the show until recently, I believe. So he was written off the show. The actor had some personal struggles, and then she married a different character later on. But he's in this. I'm not blaming any of the actors for this. They're all giving their all to whatever this weird thing is. Mr. Hooper is in this. He would die a few years later, and there's a really famous episode where they very rawly deal with grief of losing somebody when he dies without any euphemism or like, oh, he passed away. No, they just say he died. He's not coming back. It was pretty real for kids' TV then. It still would be today. So it's very weird to see this one only hint at of like, well, here's the cat's collar. You can kind of figure out what happened. This just has nothing to do with Sesame Street. But I kind of have to recommend it if you think it sounds fun because it's truly bizarre. And again, the Christmas Carol aspect of it is kind of shoehorned in. It's just, oh, you need to be nicer to this cat. So they have their 3 celebrity guest stars dressed up as ghosts. And all the costumes look ridiculous. Anne Murray just stops the whole thing in its tracks to sing a 3 or 4 minute song that has nothing to do with Christmas and nothing to do with the plot. Which again, that variety show thing. And I can almost guarantee you this is the only time on Sesame Street, and maybe just in a Muppet production, where someone has called someone else an idiot. That does not seem like a very Muppet or Sesame Street thing to do. But, it's Ethel Merman. You let her do what she's going to do, I suppose. Ugh, what a strange one. That's all I have to say about these 3, but stay tuned for the next episode, which will be released same time as this one, because that one is about an American Christmas Carol from 1979 with Henry Winkler and a huge supporting cast. I have a lot to say about that one, so stay tuned for that. Scrooge, a Christmas Carol podcast, is written, edited, and hosted by Collin Murr. Theme music is Christmas Day by T.R.G. Banks, and T.R.G. Banks' Snowfall is also used for interstitial music. Clips in this episode are from the Lord of the Rings BBC radio production from 1981, A Christmas Carol 1977, Rich Little's Christmas Carol, and A Special Sesame Street Christmas. Leaving a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify, as well as liking, commenting, and subscribing on YouTube will be a big help to me. There is another episode releasing at the same time as this one, and you can listen to that right now, wherever you listen to Scrooge, A Christmas Carol podcast. Until then, make sure to live in the past, the present, and the future, and ensure that the spirits of all three strive within you.